Hello and welcome to today's presentation on the minimum viable product. It is a core concept that you may already be aware of from our videos of the Lean Startup Circle, for instance. The minimum viable product is defined by Eric Ries as the minimum viable product or the minimum viable solution or the minimum viable service that is a version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning on the one hand and with the least effort on the other. So it is basically the bare bone of our company, of our value process. We want to follow these core processes of our business to gain as much feedback of our customers as possible. For this purpose, we can differentiate between a variety of types of minimum viable products. We may use two axes to discern between those different types. On the one hand, we have the scope of our minimum viable product, which is the amount of effort we have to take. And on the other hand, the reach, which is maybe a function of the validated learning that we want to achieve by the amount of people that we may reach at the end of the day. So there are different types, and we may start with the interview of one customer. We may explain our product or service to only one customer and gain some customer feedback. This is a very low scope with very low reach minimum viable product already. But there is a variety of other minimum viable products. For instance, you may do role plays. You may role play your service with different types of customers, for instance. And by role playing, you already have to go into a room, have to go into a situation where you have to raise the scope of your product already. Then we have the questionnaires, which are very popular out there. With the questionnaires, you can only ask a certain amount of questions, so the scope is not very high, but the reach is already risen by the amount of people that you can reach by your questionnaire. If you use online questionnaires, for instance, that would be a very high reach. Then we have some types of prototypes that we will go deeper into during this presentation, like for example paper prototypes or wireframings, which are mostly used, for instance, to prepare for information systems used on the web. You may also think of 3D prints. If you, for instance, want to start a startup, for instance, in the type of engineering, you may want to use 3D prints to get your customers an impression of what you want to attain at the end. And then there are those types of, it's called crowdfunding MVPs, that we also get to know in a few minutes. A video MVP is another MVP type with a very high reach and, let's say, a medium scope. And if we go to the high right corner of this two-dimensional graph, we'll find the product prototype. So a fully fledged functional minimum viable product. So let's dive into some of these MVPs, and let's start with the minimum viable product of a Concierge MVP. The Concierge MVP, also referred or very familiar to the called Wizard of Oz MVP. Let's start by an example. The example is Zappos, an example already introduced by Ash Mora, for instance. Zappos is a shoe company that started back in the mid-2000s and who were bought by Amazon for about $900 million in 2009. So you see they were very successful. What did they do? They started with selling shoes. They wanted to sell shoes on the web. So if you think as a customer of how do you buy shoes on the web, what does the company do? What are the bare bone processes? They have an incoming order as soon as the customer sends on buy. Then the order processing. Normally, then there will be a supplier mail to get some shoes into the warehouse. Someone goes into the warehouse, takes out the shoes, and then sends them to the customers. So what does the Concierge MVP do, and what did Zappos do? They skipped a middle part of it, and they faked a few of these steps. So although you were able to buy online these shoes, what did they do as soon as the order gets into their mailbox? They went right straight around the corner to a local shoe shop, and they bought some shoes there, just as they mentioned them on the web. They repacked them and sent them to the customer. So the customer didn't get to know that these shoes were bought locally, but the customer thought that he bought it online. And so they were pretty easily able to get some information about what type of shoes does the customer want, how do they have to improve their web page, and what can they do to make customer experience even better. So what does the Concierge MVP mean in this situation? Oftentimes you hear the sentence, fake it until you make it, or be the man behind the curtain or the woman behind the curtain. And this is exactly what the Concierge MVP means. You fake certain processes that are normally automatically or semi-automatically, and you fake them as long as you are still in this type of learning phase. And as soon as you found out that your customer really wants your product and really wants this type of customer experience, then you can go into investing into automatic systems, for instance. So you do a service step by step, you do it manually and in person, and you do it as if they were semi-automatic, even though they aren't. Let's look at another example. Maybe an example that you probably as a student already are familiar with. Let's think of you are a linguistics student at your faculty and you need books. But the most books that you get from your libraries, for instance, are already marked by certain paragraphs are already marked, and so you aren't really able to mark them on your own and with your ideas. So you may think of, well, let's come up with a new idea. Let's do a bookstore online. You create a simple landing page, and we come to that in a few minutes. You find and sell some books there by hand, so you put them just on the web. And then, as soon as you get an order, you go around the corner, buy some books, and send them right to the customer. That would be a Concierge MVP fulfilling this very specific needs. And you may use this minimum viable product, for instance, to find out how many people are really visiting your site and how many people are already ordering your books via your site. This is maybe a Concierge MVP. There are certainly different aspects and certainly different ways to follow this Concierge MVP structure for this very specific problem. But there are also other MVPs that we may want to try out. For instance, we may use a video MVP. I prepared a video MVP for you to introduce you to one way to present this solution. You find a lot of video MVPs on the web today. There are a lot of big companies today that had used MVPs in the past. And one very famous example is Dropbox. Dropbox used several different video MVPs throughout their history, and one was very famous, and it led to a citation from their CEO, Drew Houston. He said, "It draws hundreds of thousands of people to the website. Our beta list went from 5,000 people to 75,000 people, literally overnight. It totally blew us away." As you can see, a video MVP may raise a lot of awareness, and it may raise a lot of interest in your product or your solution. So a video MVP uses a video as a way to display very briefly your value proposition or the way you fulfill a value using a service or your product offering. There are a lot of different ways how to make those video MVPs, not only using professional services. And few of them are displayed right on the slide next to me. Another MVP that I already briefly mentioned is the paper prototype or the wireframing. It is a type of MVP that is oftentimes used by web-based services, web-based IT information systems. We may use, for instance, some services like Balsamiq or even PowerPoint or InDesign to scribble down the way that we think our software should to look like for the customer. We may do that for web pages as well as for mobile phone applications. And we can use software, just as I mentioned, or we can even use a pencil, some paper, scissors, and some glue to introduce our customer or potential customer to our value proposition and especially to our solution. How do we do that? We use the paper prototype that we already processed. We think of what type of tasks does the customer have to fulfill, then take the pertaining mockups that we already created, or these paper prototypes, and then we do some kind of usability testing. Most of the time you work in a team, and so I assume that even you, as you're now thinking about your ideas, for instance, already work with the team. One person of your team simulates a computer. He or she takes the paper prototype, and every time someone of your customers clicks or taps on one of your paper prototypes, the computer thinks and acts just like the computer would do if it would be implemented. Hopefully you have multiple observers to this occasion so that you can see and think of what the potential customers are doing with your IT service. And you should have at least one person to document all of these, especially as the customer is expected to think aloud very much. As soon as you have your wireframing or paper prototype, you may think of, well, maybe I bring exactly something to the web and introduce it to the whole wide world. This is oftentimes referred to as landing page mockup or landing page MVP, oftentimes extended by mobile ads or web ads, for instance. A landing page, the idea of the landing page is that you introduce your customer, your customers or your potential customers to your value proposition, your product or your service using a simple web page. You may want to begin very simplistic, so I recommend using some already finished content management system like WordPress, Drupal, or Joomla, for instance. But you should definitely think about one specific question. How do you measure the success of your landing page? There are very interesting concepts out there, like for example the R method or the Lean Analytics method that help you to think about certain key performance indicators for your landing page. So find the suitable measures and measure the exact time or the exact amount of customers that come to your web page or your landing page and their call to action. And this call to action is a very interesting and a very important thing to your landing page. I mocked up some kind of landing page right next to me. You oftentimes start with a catchphrase and your logo, right, or your brand right on the top. Then you have a few explanations, hold it very briefly about your product or your service. If you're a startup, it is oftentimes a good idea to get personal and show who you are. And this is the most important thing of your landing page. Note a call to action. What do you expect your customers to do as soon as they get to your landing page? Do you ask them for money? Do you want them to buy your product or potential product in the future? Do you want them to register to your site? What do you want them to do? And they should be at least doing something. And even if it's only adding me to your newsletter, for instance. You may want to use this landing page as I said, in extension with some kind of ads. You may want to buy some ads, for instance, at Google or at Facebook, referring to the keywords that are essential to you, and where you can get some of these customers that may be interesting for you in the future to your landing page. And if you get these potential customers to your landing page and they do not click your call to action, that would be a very, very heavy hint for you and your product and service. And maybe this should be the beginning of pivoting your web page at least. Many things that I already mentioned can be combined. And one way to combine them is by a crowdfunding campaign. Crowdfunding is also referred to as an MVP because many companies use crowdfunding as an MVP. A very important and a very famous example is Pebble, for instance. I expect that you're already familiar with Pebble. It is one of the most funded projects on Kickstarter. There are a few projects on Kickstarter that got really a lot of money and really a lot of attention. You have to be aware that there are a lot of projects that do not get enough attention, that they are not completely backed by the Kickstarter community. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting channel for you as you want to try out your MVP. You may implement, for instance, your landing page, integrate your landing page on the one hand with a video MVP right into the crowdfunding campaign and make it more powerful in this way. So you can use this crowdfunding campaign in several different ways. For instance, you can use it to assess a market demand. Do you even get attention to your campaign? You can get feedback about your product or your service. For instance, there may be some of your backers, some of your funders who give you especially money for if they get the product or if they get a nice merchandising article. And this can give you a hint about how much money do they give you in the future, for instance, as a price expectation or, for instance, an investment expectation. You may also want to test Kickstarters or Indiegogo campaigns as a marketing channel. Is it a valid marketing channel for your product or your service? And maybe you can also secure initial funding by this. There are several different platforms for crowdfunding. There is also some kind of crowd investing. I wouldn't go into deeply into this in this video, but there are a lot of videos out there on the web that you may want to look out if you're interested in this topic. And finally, we come to the product prototype. It is this type of MVP that you'll find in the two-dimensional graph right on the right upper corner. You have very high effort mostly to create a product prototype, and you may create a higher reach as the customer gets a fully or at least mostly functional prototype to test. So if you're from information systems, if you create software or hardware, you may be very familiar with prototyping as a procedure to create your product or your service. For instance, if we think of Google, Google evolved over time. They got feedback from their customers how to create value as an intermediary that they are. You see here, even though the adaptations of their user experience already gradually evolved, we nevertheless see that it changed over time. There is another example from the hardware world. Let's take it as this. It's called GoPro. Maybe you are aware of GoPro. GoPro is a camera developer, camera producer from Silicon Valley, who initially started by thinking about a type of camera that will work even if you are doing extreme sports. And they had their CEO who went throughout the world and tried to find a producer of this type of camera. And then they found a producer on a conference deep down in China, and this factory that produced the camera was able to get them to try out a camera for extreme sports with different types of customers, and they were very successful with this and produced more and more prototypes. And it's fascinating if you look at this nowadays. They started with analog cameras back then. You may also want to use product prototypes let's call it solution prototypes if you have a service. For instance, here is a restaurant prototype, or you may think of it as a restaurant prototype. You may want to use, for instance, if you think about a certain kind of food or certain kind of restaurant, you may want to check out the locations before you really buy or land a store. So you may want to go around with a car that you rented before and try out the right customers, the right products at the right locations before you really rent your location. And so you may also think of types of prototyping your service, and the Concierge MVP that I already mentioned is one way to prototype a service before you really go deeply into heavily investing. So let's sum it all up. What did I mention throughout the last minutes to you? The lean startup concept gives the minimum viable product a core part within their conceptual basis. We use minimum viable products as a way to learn fast about our customers, to learn what they want, to learn what they need, and to learn what they want to pay for. We think about ways of prototypically creating our product or our service. And this comes very, very, very heavily from IT-based startups, especially in Silicon Valley. It comes from concepts that are already very familiar to computer scientists, for instance, who oftentimes think about sentences like release early and release often. They think of this as that software is getting better as more often you release. And this is the very analogous thinking for the lean startup cycle, who say the learn early and learn often. But they refer to it as your business processes. They refer to it as your business model that you want to change and gradually evolve over time. To bring all these key concepts together, I already want to go back into one example that I already briefly mentioned. It is the example of Dropbox. Dropbox started in 2007, and that was the first time they went throughout this lean startup cycle. Their initial idea of their value proposition was that they want, or let's say he wants, Drew Houston, the CEO of, the CEO of today from Dropbox and back then. He thought of Dropbox as the main value proposition is that I do not have to pick up my USB drive and I cannot forget it as soon as it all goes into this called cloud. So you can basically throw away your USB drive. And he started with a video MVP that was uploaded to Hacker News, and it was only a 3 minutes screencast of a possible solution of Dropbox. And he got a lot of feedback from very early adopters. And then they went into a second cycle in 2008. They started a private beta launch, and they uploaded another video MVP to the web. But now they are not addressing developers, but rather more end customers. So people who are not that aware of technical background stuff. They are also early adopters, but they are a different type of customers. And this was also the time that he mentioned this before mentioned citation of where they went from 5,000 to 75,000 visitors overnight. After that, they followed a lot of other cycles where they tried out landing pages multiple times. They tried out several types of advertising, especially search engine optimization, search engine marketing, where they tried out different types of keywords. And they found out that they had a very interesting finding at the end of the day. They found out that search engine optimization and search engine marketing does not work at all. So no matter which keywords they buy on Google, no matter how much money they throw onto Google for keywords, they wouldn't raise the registrars to their platform. So why was that? They found out that only those customers wanted to use Dropbox that are already aware of the problem, and most people are not aware of it. So that's really funny. So how many times do you stand up and think of, oh, hopefully I won't forget my USB drive today? That's not a very high problem for us, not a big issue, especially not if you're not in this type of situation right at the moment. So they found out that word of mouth marketing works by far better. So they went into viral marketing, they went into a freemium model. As soon as you tried out Dropbox freely on the web several times, you got used to it, and you got aware of the problem that Dropbox really fulfills. And this leads to a higher likelihood that you want to spread this idea of Dropbox throughout your friends and your colleagues, for instance. And as you can see, they were very, very successful. Within 30 days after they started version 1.0 of Dropbox, they found 2.8 million people who got referral invites to their service. So, you see, MVPs are not a one-time thing. You use them circularly as prototypes to improve your product or your service. And you're not well advised to think of only one MVP fitting to your product or your service, but rather thinking about different types of MVP that you can integrate and implement into especially your product or your service. A lot of those things that I only briefly mentioned today can be looked up at the web. There are several videos out there, and you'll also find very good additional readings where you can dive into questions of minimum viable products and especially the lean startup concept. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something about MVPs and the lean startup cycle. And I hope to see you again in another video about one of these topics. See you then.